So in the 1930s, obviously the Depression had hit, and aviation in Canada was definitely struggling. And because there were so many flying clubs that had gotten set up throughout Canada, we had a lot of surplus pilots and not enough jobs for everybody. So a good source for jobs for these pilots was the RAF, and they were actively recruiting for both flying and non-flying positions from Britain and also from Canada. Because of the Great Depression and all of that chaos, Canada didn't really have a very large air force. It was a very small domestic air force, and it was really focused on essentially like civil aviation. So, whether you were looking for a steady job, if you were looking for more experience as a pilot, or if you were looking for adventure, the easy idea was to go and join the RAF. So by the late 1930s, increasingly more and more Canadians were going over to Britain and joining the RAF. So these Canadians became known as basically just Canadians in the RAF, and as the war developed, they started splitting them off. Obviously, Canadians served in the RAF throughout the war, but we got more and more Canadian squadrons and then more and more Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons. But it's estimated that about 1,800 Canadians served in the British flying services during the entire war. So that includes the RAF and the Fleet Air Arm. So in October of 1939, so obviously the war has broken out. It's a couple months old already. So to encourage additional recruiting and essentially as a public relations initiative, number 242 Canadian Squadron was formed within the RAF. Initially, it was commanded by Squadron Leader Father Gobel, who was an RCAF pilot on exchange with the RAF. But all except for one of the pilots and up to about 40% of its ground crew were Canadian personnel. It ended up being the largest grouping of Canadians in essentially the air battle for the war, until the arrival of actual proper number 1 Squadron RCAF in June of 1940. But at the time, in late 1939, in the early months of the war, there was fairly sporadic fighting. So there was a bit of fighting over Norway, but actual contact between the Luftwaffe and the RAF was fairly sporadic until about May of 1940. So that's when the Germans invaded the Netherlands, France, and Belgium, and it brought the RAF and the Luftwaffe into much closer proximity and obviously launched a much more violent conflict. So by the time France fell in June of 1940, or late June 1940, the British lost over 1,000 aircraft and 1,500 aircrew. A lot of those were Canadian. So 242 Squadron was committed fairly piecemeal to France, and they were very actively engaged during this period. Gobel claimed the first RCAF aerial victory on the 25th of May, but by the time the squadron was withdrawn to England in the middle of June to rest, rebuild, recoup, there's such a huge number of casualties, and those pilots were subsequently replaced by mainly British pilots, that for all practical purposes after that, the squadron was kind of just Canadian in name only. So initially had a very large number of Canadians, but because of attrition, it became less and less of a Canadian squadron. So this photo from left to right is Dennis Crowley Milling, Flying Officer Hugh Tamblin, who's Canadian, Flight Lieutenant Percival or Stan Turner, who's Canadian, Sergeant Joseph Seville, Pilot Officer Norman Campbell, who's Canadian, Pilot Officer William McKnight, who's Canadian, Squadron Leader Douglas Bader, who is their commanding officer, he's British, Flight Lieutenant George Ball, Pilot Officer Michael Homer, and Marvin Brown, who is Canadian. So a mixture of Canadians and British in 242 Squadron. So Canada was fairly alarmed, the Canadian government was fairly alarmed with the possibility of the defeat of Britain early on in the war. So they sent, Canada sent our only Canadian Hurricane-equipped squadron, which is number 1 Fighter Squadron, to England on the 8th of June. And just as a sign of how small the RCAF was in 1940, the squadron had to be brought up to wartime strength by amalgamating it with the flying and ground personnel of number 115 City of Montreal Squadron prior to departure. So they crammed the two of them together, sent them off to England with very little preparation. 2 other Royal Canadian Air Force units had already been sent to England, which was number 110 and 112 Army Cooperation Squadrons, but they didn't really take an active part in the Battle of Britain. But they did serve as a source for replacement pilots. So as attrition happened, they would pull pilots out of these Army Cooperation Squadrons. So number 1 Squadron arrived in England on the 20th of June and essentially immediately embarked on very rapid, very intense training to bring it up to combat standards. During the opening phase of the battle, both sides, the RAF and the Luftwaffe, were essentially building up their forces, testing each other out, getting a feel for their opponents, learning tactics, learning what worked, what didn't work. And the Luftwaffe was mainly concentrating its attacks on shipping in the English Channel, on coastal ports, defensive positions, and basically they were essentially testing each other's waters until the Germans launched like a very strong offensive. When they were able, the RAF were scrambling its fighters to intercept German attackers. Sometimes these were very large engagements, and it led to quite a lot of growing casualties on both sides and alarmed everybody in Britain and obviously in Canada back home. First Canadian killed was Duncan Hewitt, who was 20 years old, and he was part of 501 Squadron RAF from St. John, New Brunswick. So he died while trying to intercept a German aircraft on the 12th of July, 1940. A couple other Canadians were killed in this phase. And number 1 RCAF Squadron was designated, not to be confused with number 1 Squadron RAF. And it was essentially doing most of its training at Croydon, south of London. They were very quickly introduced when London started getting bombed at the end of June of 1940. In August, the Luftwaffe were launching huge raids on RAF airfields, trying to destroy the RAF on the ground or in air-to-air combat. The first Canadian to die in that phase of the battle was a guy from BC. His Hurricane was shot down over the Channel in August by a Messerschmitt 109. And a couple other Canadians were killed with RAF squadrons during this time. The guy on the left here, William McKnight, was born in Edmonton in 1918, but grew up in Calgary, and he's more closely associated with Calgary, but he was born in Edmonton. So in 1939, he went to medical school at the University of Alberta, and he was known as kind of a brash and cocky individual. So he was almost expelled from school a couple times, but a British recruiting mission came, and he saw it as a chance for adventure and an opportunity to leave behind his girlfriend, who he had a fairly tumultuous relationship with. So he decided, I'm going to be a fighter pilot, and he sailed for England in February of 1939. It's obviously before the war broke out. So he joined in early 1939. He served in 242 Squadron during the final phase of the Battle of France. And he was immediately quite successful. So he scored 17 victories, as well as 2 shared and 3 unconfirmed kills, until he was shot down and killed on the 12th of January 1941 during a fighter sweep over Calais. So in a very short period of time, 6 months, he became a very successful ace until he was actually killed. By the end of the war, he was Canada's 5th highest scoring ace, despite being killed 4 years before the war ended. So the photo here, we've got McKnight on the left, who's Canadian, Douglas Bader in the center, who's British, and Eric Ball on the right, who's British, and they're all in 242 Canadian Squadron. Bader, in the middle, is a very interesting character. He's British. I'm not going to talk about him quite a lot, but he was essentially a very successful pilot. He was credited with 22 aerial victories, 4 shared victories, 6 probables, and 11 aircraft damaged. He joined the Royal Air Force in 1928, and in 1931 he was practicing aerobatics, crashed, and lost both of his legs. Almost died, recovered, ended up retaking his flight training, and passed all of his check flights, and requested reactivation as a pilot with prosthetic legs. So there was no regulations at the time applicable to the situation, but he was retired against his will on medical grounds. When the war broke out, though, he returned to the Royal Air Force, and he was accepted as a pilot. So Despite losing both of his legs, he ended up going on to be a very successful ace during the war. This is Eric Ball on the left, Bader in the middle, and McKnight on the right. So this is a 242 Squadron Hurricane, and it's a boot kicking Hitler in the butt on the nose of the aircraft. Obviously, probably the most famous Edmontonian that served in the Battle of Britain was Howard Peter, or Cowboy Blatchford. So he was born in Edmonton on the 25th of February 1912, and obviously he was the son of Kenny Blatchford, who was the mayor who was responsible for the creation of Blatchford Field. So he trained as a pilot in Edmonton, and he ended up going overseas in February of 1936 to enlist in the Royal Air Force. At the start of the war, he was flying mainly photo reconnaissance operations, but he transitioned to combat duty in September of 1940. And at first he was flying Hurricanes with number 17 and number 257 squadrons during the last months of the Battle of Britain. He ended up making the first kill by a Canadian in the Second World War when he was part of a flight of 3 Spitfires that shot down a Heinkel 111 on October 17th, 1939. He ended up earning the Distinguished Flying Cross in December of 1940. At the time, he rose up to squadron leader. He was leading a squadron that, in one particular flight, destroyed 8 aircraft, damaged another 5 on the ground in a single day. He ran out of ammunition because it was, such a busy flight, and he ended up using his aircraft to ram and damage an enemy aircraft, and then chase away 2 others by making essentially feint attacks on the aircraft. So that kind of earned him the nickname of Cowboy, also from being from Alberta. But he was kind of got this reputation as being kind of a maverick hotshot. But he was also known as a very outstanding pilot. Rose very quickly to the rank of wing commander and became the commanding officer for 257 Squadron. I wasn't able to get the sound working on this video, but if you go on YouTube when you're after the lecture's over, they have some colorized footage of the Battle of Britain, which is actually quite interesting. So just go look for Battle of Britain footage in color and you'll find it. So this gentleman, Han Ehlers, was a German military pilot. He served in the Luftwaffe during the Second World War, and he also became a fighter ace, and he was credited with 55 aerial victories. So very particularly deadly ace. He ended up shooting down Blatchford over Holland, and Blatchford was killed in combat, unfortunately. Most of the Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons were formed as part of Article 15. So Article 15 squadrons essentially dictated that graduates from Dominion Air Forces, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, would be assigned to squadrons either formed by their own air forces or with a specific designation denoting them as Australian, New Zealand, Canadian squadrons. But under the operational control of a local air force, which is mostly the RAF. So these are Article 15 squadrons. Article 16 and Article 17 stipulated that the United Kingdom government would be responsible for paying and the entitlements of all those aircrews trained by the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. But all of those squadrons would ultimately belong to the Dominion Air Forces. So Britain's supposed to pay for them, but they're actually RAF, RCAF squadrons. And this idea was mainly an idea by our Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, during negotiations for the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. So as a result, we ended up getting 44 Canadian squadrons, 17 Australian squadrons, and 6 New Zealand Article 15 squadrons. So most personnel from all of these different Dominion Air Forces, while they were under RAF operational control, were assigned to British units. So the intent was there, but in actual practice, it didn't necessarily work out. Canada was pretty insistent on its airmen going specifically to RCAF squadrons overseas so that we would maintain this Canadian identity. And we had obviously a little bit greater success than some of the other countries. And because of this, in January of 1943, we were able to form our bomber squadrons into a wholly separate RCAF formation within Bomber Command, which was number 6 group. And that was commanded by a Canadian Air Vice Marshal. This gentleman is Robert Bissett, who was born in Edmonton, and he's the son of Alderman Athelstan Bissett. So like Blatchford, he ended up joining the RAF in 1937 before the war broke out. He served in number 102 Ceylon Squadron, flying the Whitley Mark III, and his first operational flight was on the night of the 4th and 5th of September 1939, dropping propaganda leaflets in Germany. When number 405 Squadron was formed in 1941, it formed a nucleus of trained Canadian personnel who had served in various RAF units, and he moved to that. So he transferred to the new Canadian Squadron, transferred to the Wellington, and painted it with this indigenous head and named his aircraft Thundercloud. So this aircraft is in the background is Wellington bomber. They were obviously flying bombing missions over Germany, and in November of 1941, he and his crew were assigned to fly Wellington Mark II coded H, which has completed 26 squadrons. This had a very large maple leaf under the pilot window and 3 rows of white bombs painted on the nose. So pretty sure that this is this aircraft. But it was never seen again, and they didn't come back. 418 Squadron is obviously one that we talk about a lot at the museum. 418 was a Title 15 squadron formed at Debden in the UK in late 1941, and it ended up becoming Canada's only intruder squadron during the war. So by March of 1942, the squadron was fully operational, and they were equipped with the Douglas Boston Mark III and assigned to night intruder duty. Like a lot of Article 15 squadrons, it was initially crewed by non-Canadians. Basically everybody was British. One person was from Mexico, and they ended up merging the ground crew from 23 Squadron at RAF Ford. So initially it was, even though it was RCAF Squadron, it was entirely crewed by RAF and British personnel. So the Boston, which is the Douglas DB-7, was originally ordered by the French government, but when France fell, the United Kingdom government took over the contract and then heavily modified it to meet their needs. Designated it the Mark II and the Mark III. So 418 Squadron had the Mark III, or the DB-7B. So it's equipped with 4 303 machine guns in 2 troughs and 2 blisters on the side of the nose. There's 2 more in the mid-upper gun position and 1 through the floor of the fuselage. And it could also be fitted with a cannon pack of 4 Hispano 20mm cannons, which sounds like a pretty familiar armament because that's also the same armament as the Mosquito, which they got later in the war. So it had a crew of a navigator and bomb aimer in the nose, navigator/bomb aimer in the nose, a pilot in a very cramped cockpit, and a wireless/air gunner above the bomb bay. I'm just going to go back to the previous photo. So the pilot sat up here, the bomb aimer navigator sat back here, and the wireless operator, you can't see it, but he's actually sitting backwards in the back of the Boston. And although this looks like a pretty large aircraft, it looks like a B-25 or an A-26, it's very narrow, so it's actually a single seat cockpit. The wireless air gunner actually had backup controls in the back of the aircraft in case the pilot was killed, but he's facing backwards, so I'm not entirely sure how that worked. Probably not very well. So the Boston was fairly fast for its time. It had 2 1,600 horsepower Wright Cyclones, top speed of about 546 kilometers an hour, and a range of about 1,600 kilometers. So as an intruder squadron, 418 would generally fly at night, and they'd patrol over enemy territory, and they'd be essentially on the hunt for returning aircraft and night fighters. That they were hoping that airports would turn the lights on, turn the landing lights on, and they would be able to catch pilots unawares. They also ended up harassing a lot of student pilots that way because they were training pilots to be able to do night operations. So once the airport lights came on, they would pounce and take people unawares. So generally they were flying in groups of 2 at a time. Occasionally they had a very specific mission. They'd go and hit a rail target, but a lot of the times it was just fly over, see what you can find, and come back. The aircraft are painted this kind of matte black, and the lettering on the side is this dark red. It's very different than the later Mosquitoes. As the squadron started growing, losing people, transferring people, they started getting more and more Canadians. So they started naming a lot of their aircraft after Canadian cities. So in this photo, we've got Sergeant Irving, who's from Toronto, Rich is from Toronto, Hutchinson from Toronto, Pringle's from Toronto, Duxfield is from Timmins, Ontario, Keynes is from Ottawa, Ontario, Field is from Toronto, Sharple's from Toronto, and Chabot is from Sudbury, Ontario. So not very many Edmontonians in 418 Squadron at this time. So there's Toronto is one of their aircraft, Ottawa's another aircraft, but definitely a lot of people from Ontario. So in 1942, they started operations. They have 9 Bostons. Their first mission is basically they sent 8 at a time to bomb oil refineries in Belgium. And almost immediately, they start running into a lot of problems. So one of their aircraft is not able to release its bombs. Almost every mission that they go on, they start having a lot of reliability issues with their Bostons. The cannon packs jam. They have a lot of problems with, figuring up the flight characteristics of the Boston. In April of 1942, they lost 3 aircraft in 4 days. 2 of them were on non-combat mishaps, and 1 was lost in combat duty. So, when you're losing 2/3 of your aircraft to non-combat related losses, it's particularly problematic. So these are photos from the Imperial War Museum in the UK. So this is THR of 418 Squadron. So this is off the French coast, and it's on its way back to Bradwell Bay in the UK after a night sortie. This particular aircraft was lost over another night sortie in France in November of 1942. This one is coded X, and this photo is also from 1941, from 42. They did a lot of night operations, so this particular photograph, it's illuminated by a chance light on the right, also at Bradwell Bay. So they're about to take off on a night intruder mission. Their first victory is April of 1942. So Sergeants Harding, who's RAF, Shannon, who's the observer, and Irving, who's the air gunner, in a Boston from Holmesley South, are flying over France, and they're credited with one unidentifiable enemy aircraft damaged. If you go online, you can find a lot of gun camera footage of 418 Squadron aircraft, and because they're flying at night, I don't know how they ever identified what particular aircraft they're flying, because all you see in a gun camera footage, mainly the gun camera footage is from the Mosquitoes later, but it's literally just black, and then all of a sudden there's flashes, and you can see maybe an outline of an aircraft in one frame, and then it's gone. So, yeah, I do not... I mean, obviously they took the pilot's words for it, but when you actually look at the gun camera footage, it's really difficult to see what's going on. So in April and May, they start getting their first kills, and they start achieving a decent amount of success despite all their setbacks with these Bostons. One of the early members that joins in 1942 is Flight Sergeant Wilf Proudfoot from Edmonton. He ends up being a ground crew member with 418 Squadron, and he ends up serving through pretty much the entire war. He was quite old at the time. Not quite old. He was in his 40s. He'd served in the First World War, and basically essentially should have been too old to serve, but was very stubborn and just kept showing up and managed to stay. If you're ever around, talk to Bernie. He knew Wilf Proudfoot, and he has a lot of interesting stories to tell about him. So 418's real success came when they switched from the Boston to the Mosquito. The Mosquito is a pretty interesting aircraft, and Jeff de Havilland was experimenting with different designs and different ideas for aircraft. Because Britain had a general shortage of aluminum, he was looking for a way of creating an aircraft that didn't rely on aluminum, but still was able to perform successfully as a bomber. And the general thought at the time for bombers was that they needed a lot of turrets and they needed a lot of defenses so they'd be able to shoot down fighter aircraft if they were attacking them. So he came with this plan to instead say, well, what if we strip all of the guns, basically all of the guns off of the bomber, make it as fast as possible, and that way the fighter aircraft can't actually catch up to it. So his proposal was this unarmed bomber using wood construction. So it's a laminated skin of Sitka spruce with an interior core of balsa wood. So very, very light, ends up being a fairly strong aircraft, and powered by the Merlin V12 engine. So very powerful engine, very light. They built the Mosquito in 1940, and it proves faster than the Spitfire. Completely radical departure from all of its existing bombers, and they start to realize that, okay, this actually can serve not only as a bomber, but as a fighter bomber, as a fighter, as a night fighter, as an intruder, as a photo reconnaissance platform, as a VIP transport. So by the end of the war, there's, I think, 35 different marks of the Mosquito, so particularly successful. And 418 is generally equipped with the fighter bomber Mark VI version of the Mosquito. So it's got, like the Boston, 4 303 machine guns, 4 cannons, and it can carry bombs as well. But generally much more capable than the Boston, which by this time was significantly out of date. They started getting a lot of success with the Mosquito. They were continuing their night raids, but because they were becoming so successful, they started doing daylight operations. So they would end up flying at treetop level at about 50 feet above the ground, really deep into French territory or German territory to attack shipping, attack trains, hit a shipyard, hit an airfield, shoot up a bunch of aircraft, and fly away before the ground crew could even react. So this is actually footage. It doesn't need sound, but this is actual footage from an intruder mission. Not 418 Squadron, but I'll skip ahead. So you can see just how low they're flying. Well, it's grainy and black and white, but you can kind of see how low they're flying. So pretty much all of their operations were done at very low level and very high speed. So they would fly in, hit a target, fly away before people could react. Again, this whole video is on YouTube, so if you search for it under RAF low-level attacks in the Netherlands, it's a pretty interesting video, and it's actually narrated. On June 12th of 1943, their commanding officer, Wing Commander Little, and his observer took off. The plugs were fouled in their aircraft. It lost power. They couldn't climb. They hit a hill and the aircraft exploded. That was in the Boston area. So Paul Davoud became the new commanding officer, and he was the squadron's first Canadian commanding officer. So he was a very top-scoring student. He went through training with the Royal Canadian Air Force, but couldn't find a job. So he ended up going to the RAF, like a lot of people. But before the war began, he ended up coming back to Canada because James Richardson had offered him a job with Canadian Airways. So he became a bush pilot, and he was flying the Junkers W-34, mainly in Yellowknife. And when the war broke out, he rejoined the RCAF. So he had a lot of experience as a bush pilot, and was a very capable leader and a very beloved leader of 418 Squadron. As probably most of you know, the Mosquito was also one of the few aircraft that was able to intercept the German V-1 cruise missiles that were launched against Britain. By the end of the war, because of its success in attacking ground targets, air targets, V-1s, 418 Squadron ended up becoming the top scoring Royal Canadian Air Force squadron in terms of air-to-air kills and air-to-ground kills. Mainly thanks to a lot of its ace pilots, including Russ Bannock, who's from Edmonton, Johnny Kane, who's from Edmonton. Some of their crews would go out and they'd score as many as 7 aircraft in a single day. Because by the war's end, so many more Canadians were serving in 418 Squadron, they also got a large contingent of Edmontonians. So Russ Bannock, Johnny Kane, and Gordon Williamson, who was a sportscaster and reporter for the Edmonton Journal. So he petitioned Edmonton City Council to adopt the squadron in 1944, and there was a general scheme to adopt Royal Canadian Air Force squadrons by cities in Canada. The city would then become known as City of Edmonton, City of Saskatoon Squadron, and the city would be responsible for sending care packages, mainly through the Lions Club. So he wrote back and he said, hey, we're a really awesome squadron, we have some Edmontonians, we think the city should adopt the squadron. So they did, and the 418 became the City of Edmonton Squadron. Russ Bannock, as I mentioned, was from Edmonton. He was originally named Sloko Bannock. His name was later anglicized to Russell Bannock because he didn't really feel like he fit in. He earned his pilot's license here at the Edmonton Flying Club and his commercial license, in 1938, his commercial license in 1939, and then he went to work for Yukon Southern Air Transport. And he actually flew the museum's Barclay Grow when he was with Yukon Southern. So he enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1940, and that's when he formally anglicized his name. So they commissioned him, they sent him to Ontario, and he served most of the war as a flight instructor. He was constantly applying for transfers overseas, but it wasn't until 1944 that they actually granted his wish. And a lot of pilots who had significant flying experience when they joined were actually made flight instructors. A lot of them kind of resented that a lot because they felt like they were being held back and they really wanted to go serve overseas. But the thought was, because they were so experienced, that it was much more valuable for them to be serving as flight instructors and training people in proper techniques. By the end of the war, though, they realized they didn't need to train quite so many pilots, and they started accepting these requests to transfer these pilots overseas. So he goes over to Europe, he trains in an operational training unit to learn combat techniques, and he joins 418 Squadron in 1944, flying the Mosquito. He ends up shooting down 19 unmanned V-1 buzz bombs, and with those 19 added to his 11 confirmed kills, he ends up with being one of Canada's top scoring aces of the Second World War. And he developed a lot of the techniques used to shoot down the V-1. Because the V-1 has a large warhead on it, so if you chase it, shoot it, and it blows up, it'll rain debris and exploding bits back on you. So you have to approach it from an angle, at a combined speed of several hundred miles an hour, have a very accurate shot, and pull away before you fly through the debris cloud. So he was one of the people that was really responsible for developing these techniques. So he got the Distinguished Service Order and the Distinguished Flying Cross twice for his service during the war. He became a wing commander, he became their commanding officer, and then ended up transferring to 406 Squadron in November of 1944. When he came back after the war, he joined de Havilland, became their chief test pilot, operations manager. He was one of the chief test pilot for the Beaver and the Otter, and really had a lot to do with de Havilland Canada's success after the war. This is a photo of him when he visited the museum in 1915. His navigator, also an interesting character, he was Scottish and very well educated and very interested in music. So he ended up writing a symphony in honor of Russ Bannock. The Calgary Mosquito Society, if you go on YouTube, has some very good interviews with Russ Bannock where he talks about his experiences during the war, his life after the war. So if you go search up Russ Bannock or the Calgary Mosquito Society on YouTube, they've got some really excellent videos. If you've been to the museum recently, you've probably seen our new half-scale model of a V1. The original V1 is propelled by a pulse jet engine. It's a liquid-fueled pulse jet engine, which gives it a really distinctive sound, which is why it's called the Buzz Bomb. So originally, the real V1 is about 30 feet long. It's got a 2,000-pound warhead, and it has a range of about 450 kilometers. So they would launch them from France. This started in, I think, June of 1944, about a week after the Normandy invasion. And the V1 was capable of reaching speeds of about 400 kilometers an hour. So it was very, very difficult to shoot down for anti-aircraft fire. So very, very few aircraft. So the most up-to-date Spitfires, Tempests, Mosquitoes, Mustangs, and then the jet fighter, the Meteor, were one of the only ones that could actually shoot it down. So Russ Bannock became known as one of the saviors of London because of all of his successes in shooting down these V1s. This is another Edmonton pilot. He is flying what's called the John bomber, which is, you can see on the nose of the Hurricane, it's got Our John written on it. So this is in honor of Wing Commander John Gillen, who was reported missing in 1941. So it's a bomber variant of a Hurricane. This aircraft is flown by Flight Lieutenant John Rutherford Stern from Edmonton, who is a capable pilot. He got the DFC. Before the war, he was studying engineering at the U of A. He was only there for about 1 year, and then he joined up with the RCAF. He ended up becoming the commander of his squadron at 21 years of age. So it always strikes me as quite remarkable when I learned just how young everybody was during the Second World War, especially being responsible for, commanding large groups of people and having a lot of responsibility. So he did a lot of operations over the Dover Straits, attacking shipping, and then he was killed flying a Typhoon in August of 1943, shot down by flak over France. This one on the very left is Joseph Labuda, who was originally from Czechoslovakia, or like the Slovak side of Czechoslovakia. So he ended up moving to Canada in 1938 with his mother. His father had previously come to Alberta a year before, just barely escaping the Nazi takeover of the country. And so in 1940, he was 17, and he decided that he wanted to join the RCAF, but they turned him away because he was too young. So by himself, he ended up traveling all the way to the UK, and he joined up with the RAF as a pilot in February of 1942. And because he spoke Czech, they ended up assigning him to both number 312 and 313 squadrons, which were almost exclusively crewed by Czechs and Slovaks in exile, mainly because of his ability to speak the language and speak English equally. So he flew Spitfires with the RAF until 1945, and he was primarily the wingman of the squadron commanders of both Czech squadrons. In 1945, at the very end of the war, he transferred to the RAF and continued flying Spitfires to the end of the war. And I find his story particularly interesting because when the Labudas immigrated to Canada, that was the year that Canada accepted the fewest immigrants of any year since before the First World War. The Great Depression had caused huge unemployment across the country, and it fueled a lot of ethnic tensions in the country, and a lot of anti-immigration sentiments. And when the war erupted, there was a requirement for immigrants from countries aligned with Axis powers to register as enemy aliens. And even though they'd escaped the Nazi takeover of Czechoslovakia, they were considered, potentially suspicious, including Germans, Italians, Japanese, Ukrainians, Czechs, and Slovaks. So despite that, he wanted, obviously, to go back, serve his country. He was too young, so he joined up with the RAF, and came back to Canada, became a power engineer at Wabamun. But anyway, the experience that Canada had during the war and the horrors that Nazi Germany had caused really caused Canada to look inwards after the war and really re-examine our harsh immigration policies. Progress was pretty slow. Obviously, we favored a lot of Western immigrants right after the war. We were very strongly discriminating against Asians until, late into the 1960s. So it was really not until the 1960s that we reversed most of our very racist immigration policies. Norman Reed is another Edmontonian. He graduated high school just as the Second World War was erupting, and he wanted to be a pilot. So he signed on with the Royal Canadian Air Force, but unfortunately for him, he was very, very good at math. So his mathematical aptitude ended up diverting him to training as a navigator. So he came here to No. 2 Air Observer School at Blatchford Field. Because he was such a good navigator, he was posted to No. 40 Squadron RCAF on Wellington bombers. They were operating from bases in southern Italy, and they were mainly operating over Romania, destroying the oil fields, bridges, dropping mines in the rivers. And he ended up getting shot, or his aircraft ended up getting shot down twice. And his 41st and final mission is Wellington is shot down by flak over Yugoslavia. He bails out, parachutes to the ground, and Chetnik resistance fighters ended up rescuing him. He spent about 98 days dodging Nazis, meeting up with American forces, other downed aircrew. And then American forces ended up staging a rescue. So they flew in, picked up him and a bunch of his other fellow aviators and flew them out. So he came back to Canada. His mathematical aptitude ended up making him study engineering. So he got a bachelor's degree at the WWII in civil engineering after the war and spent most of his career building bridges. So during the war, he spent a lot of his time as a navigator on bombers that were destroying bridges, came back to Canada and built bridges in Alberta. So his firm, Reed Crowther and Partners, designed and built a lot of the major highway and freeway interchanges and overpasses here in Alberta. When he retired, his teenage dream of becoming a pilot never died, so he ended up buying a surplus Tiger Moth that had served in Edmonton, and he flew it a whole series of flights all the way from Ontario to British Columbia in hops. And then he decided he was not really young enough to fly it safely, so he ended up donating it first to the BC Aviation Museum, and then I don't know exactly how, but we ended up getting it about 10 years later. But he decided, probably because of his advocacy, that that particular Tiger Moth had served at number 16 EFTS, so it really belonged to the Alberta Aviation Museum. So the Tiger Moth that we have is really thanks to Norman Reed. Doug Matheson is also from Edmonton, and he spent a lot of time as a youth at Blatchford Field, watching aircraft, being an aviation nerd. And he really wanted to serve his country, so he joined the Royal Canadian Air Force right at the start of the Second World War. Went to Ontario to train, and then went on to Europe and served as a Spitfire pilot with 411 Squadron. So that's him in training on the left and as a Spitfire pilot on the right. So most of his missions took him across the English Channel, mainly attacking ground targets and escorting bombers. He participated in the Dieppe raid in August of 1942, and very narrowly escaped death in December of 1943 when he was shot down over northern France. He parachuted in, and he was rescued by the French resistance very quickly, who hid him in their basement. They forged documents, they gave him a new identity, and hid him for about 5 months. About 5 months later, his luck ran out, and the German police discovered their resistance cell and carted him off to Stalag Luft 3, which is a prisoner of war camp in Poland. And that's obviously the prisoner of war camp from the famous Great Escape. He arrived after that particular Great Escape. He was there until the end of the war, and essentially as the Allied forces were moving in and they were marching a lot of the prisoners out, a random prison guard just decided to shoot him for no particular reason, and he almost died again at the end of the war. he survived, thankfully, came back to Edmonton, and then he served as a pilot in the Reserve Squadron with 418 Squadron. Enrolled as a law student at the U of A, admitted to the bar in 1952, and he had a really strong duty for serving his country, serving his community. So he ended up becoming a judge, and he was very, very interested in aviation his whole life. So he was a private pilot. Him and his family went everywhere in Canada. He had a beach bonanza. And he was very heavily involved in the Aviation Hall of Fame, the Edmonton Flying Club, the Reynolds Alberta Museum, and 418 Squadron as their honorary colonel. So at 87 years of age, he ended up enrolling in helicopter lessons while still regularly flying his own aircraft. The next year, he was killed when his plane crashed in the Badlands on a sightseeing trip by himself. And not really sure why. Potentially he had a heart attack or something, but didn't necessarily seem to be anything wrong with his aircraft. Tony Cashman, also from Edmonton, and Tony Cashman is obviously much more well known in general as a historian and an author. And a lot of people are surprised when I tell them that he was so involved with aviation and he served in the war. So he was very interested in aviation from an early age. His uncle was George Gorman, who was Watt May's partner in May Gorman Airlines after the First World War. So he ended up serving as a navigator in Halifax bombers during the Second World War and survived a tour of about 30 missions. After the war, he came back to Edmonton. He went to Indiana for a while, and then he ended up flying again as a navigator with 418 Squadron Association in B-25 Mitchells out of the Aviation Museum. And he was also their public relations officer. Outside of the military, he had a very long journalism career and was very well known as a storyteller. So he had radio programs on CKUA, wrote a lot of books, newspaper columns, and he was definitely like the preeminent Edmonton historian. So if you ever want to read a book about Edmonton aviation, Gateway to the North, which he published in 2002, is a really comprehensive history of aviation in Edmonton. Very, very interesting fellow. Amazing memory. There's a very large painting of a B-25 in the 418 gallery, and it's dated 1961. The people in 418 didn't really know where it came from, and I'd hung it up inside the 418 gallery. He came for his 95th birthday, and he spotted it right away, and he said, "Oh, you still have the painting?" And I said, "Oh, you know about that painting?" He's like, "Yeah, my neighbor painted it. I asked my neighbor to paint it in 1961. So, yeah, very interesting guy, absolute wealth of knowledge. Michael Cooten, we have a small display of his in the 418 gallery, but also at the Royal Alberta Museum. There's quite a few artifacts dedicated to Michael Cooten. He was also a navigator. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and then came back to Edmonton and served for another 20 years in 418 Squadron. And he was very interested in aviation again as a kid. He wrote in his diary about the first time he saw an aircraft flying overhead, and hearing this strange noise and being completely amazed. He really wanted to be a pilot when he joined the RCAF, but during his flight training, he ended up practicing spins in his Tiger Moth. So he threw his Tiger Moth into a spin and didn't realize that his seatbelts were not quite done up tight. So his aircraft started falling underneath him. He ended up rising out of the seat and getting caught on his fairly loose seatbelts. So to recover from a spin in an aircraft, you need to kick opposite rudder to the direction you're spinning, which you need to reach the pedals to do that. So he ended up spiraling all the way in until he was able to grab onto his seatbelts, pull himself back into his cockpit, stomp on the rudder pedal, and recover basically at treetop level. And it was a religious experience for him, so he decided that then and there that God was telling him that he really should not be a pilot. So he went on to be a navigator instead. And he was one of the best navigators in the Royal Canadian Air Force. So he finished at the top of his class, and he was assigned to a special unit flying Halifax bombers and Halifaxes and Lancasters to India. So he was responsible for navigating the entire trip from the UK to India. And when he came back, he was also the lead navigator for 1,000 aircraft raids on Germany. So he was the primary navigator that essentially everybody else was supposed to follow. So quite a large responsibility. So he served with over 30 bombing raids, and which got him the Distinguished Flying Cross. So as I said, he came back to Edmonton after the war and joined the post office, but he really missed flying. So in 1949, he joined 418 Squadron with the Weekend Warriors. His younger brother, John, was too young to serve in the Second World War, but really wanted to follow in his footsteps. So John also became a navigator in 418 Squadron, and he was pretty tragically killed in 1955 when their B-25 hit a ferry cable across the North Saskatchewan River near Devon. John had recently been married. His wife was pregnant at the time, and Michael Cluton really wanted to help out Helen, so he started hanging out, making sure that she was well provided for. And then 6 months later said, we should probably just get married. And she rejected him immediately and thought that was a terrible idea. But they ended up growing on each other. They got married. They had 3 kids of their own and raised a very large family for the next 50 years. Very nice guy. He was also a very active volunteer here at the museum before he got ill. He passed away in 2018. Johnny Kane, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross 3 times. So he's got the DFC and 2 bars, and he's one of only 6 Canadians to win the DFC 3 times. So he's born in Edmonton in 1920, the third of 7 children and the oldest of 4 boys. And he grew up on a fox and mink farm on the south end of Edmonton. Enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1941, and after training, he gets posted to 418 Squadron. He serves with 418 from September of 1943 to May 44, and then he comes back to Canada and becomes a flight instructor. In one particular flight on May 2nd, 1944, he destroyed 6 enemy aircraft in a single day and damaged 2 more at a German seaport on the Baltic. And then his aircraft was damaged, and he had to fly 800 kilometers back to base with a single engine in his Mosquito. So he was Edmonton's top scoring ace from the Second World War. Very dashing figure. He was very famous. There's all sorts of newspaper articles about him. He was really strongly like the hometown hero. And after the war, TransCanada Airlines offered him $1,000 a month to come and fly for them. But he ended up coming back to Edmonton. He went back to his mink farm and just dived into mink farming. So he ended up developing a special shade of mink fur, and by 1966, the Kane Fur Farms was Canada's largest mink ranch. They had 34,000 animals, but it closed in 1973. So initially, it was kind of by the Mount Pleasant Cemetery, and then in Ellerslie. Yeah, by the end of the war, he had 21 destroyed aircraft, 2 shared, and a further 7 damaged. So he was Edmonton's top-scoring ace. Donald McVicker was actually born in Oxbow, Saskatchewan, but he was brought up in Edmonton. He went to college, though, in Winnipeg, and then came back to the University of Alberta. So he got a pilot's license in 1936 with the Edmonton Flying Club, and his first job was actually as a radio operator with McInnes Fish Company in the bush, giving weather reports to Grant McConaughey's fish flights. So he's a radio operator working with bush pilots. He then got a job with Mackenzie Air Service in Edmonton, and then later as a Department of Transport radio range operator in Cranbrook. In 1941, though, he joined No. 2 Air Observer School in Edmonton, and from there went on to the Royal Air Force Ferry Command as a captain/navigator. So this is his graduating class at No. 2 AOS. He is the 6th from the left. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here. And in 1942, he got the King's Commendation for Arctic flying. He wrote several books on his time as a ferry pilot in Ferry Command, which I would very highly recommend. Very, very interesting story. He was a flying boat pilot in Ferry Command. He carried out the first ever polar Europe to Western Canada flights over the Crimson routes. In 1944, he became an officer of the Order of the British Empire for valuable services in the air. So very accomplished ferry pilot. And I think as a ferry pilot, he ended up ferrying aircraft to 39 different countries around the globe. Ross McBain, obviously of McBain camera fame, ended up joining the British Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm in 1943 during the Second World War. A friend of his had done it, and he was looking for adventure and decided it was a good idea. So he ended up flying Corsairs in the Pacific from the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious. He jokes, we have an oral history interview with him, and he jokes that he almost became a Japanese ace, not because he shot down 3 Japanese fighters, but because he ended up writing off 3 Corsairs. One particular one, he was coming in too hot on the deck of Victorious and pulled back to flare. It was going too fast, ended up basically floating, dropping down very suddenly and hitting the island of the aircraft carrier. So they sent him to further training in the Admiralty Islands for a while, and he's got a lot of interesting stories about a lot of really routine and really boring flights that pilots had to do. So it wasn't all excitement and adventure. He did a lot of flights like calibrating radar for the Australian cruisers, so they would be flying back and forth at particular altitudes, so the cruisers could calibrate their radar. After the war, he comes back to Edmonton. He's very interested in photography, takes a course in Vancouver, sets up a camera business in Edmonton, which is obviously the famous McBain camera. He was very interested in aviation still, and he was a private pilot for basically the rest of his life, well into his 70s. So that's basically all I have for today. It's obviously not every Canadian or every Edmontonian that served in the war. Next month, we're going to come back to Edmonton, and we're going to talk about number 2 AOS, number 16 EFTS, people that served here, the Northwest Staging Route, and a much more local story. So obviously wasn't able to cover everything, but if you have any questions or you have any suggestions for what I should include next time, if there's anything that's particularly interesting to you.
That's great, Ryan.
All right. Then I will see you all either in person here or in a month. Or you'll see me on YouTube.
Hey, Ryan. Thanks. See you tomorrow.
Have a good night.